Hi, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to look at an extract now from the Hound of the Baskervilles. All the page numbers I'm going to be talking about come from the PDF copy of the novella, and I've put a copy of the extract up on the Google Classroom for you to follow through as well. So let's have a look at this. Over the course of this short video, I hope it'll be short, I'm going to give you an overview of one excerpt. I'm going to identify and define a few of the keywords, and I'm going to talk about how this particular excerpt relates to the bigger picture and how this passage telescopes what's coming forward to us with the foreshadowing. See what I did there? I like a little bit of visual imagery to create a joke that nobody notices. Right, moving right along. So, really what you need to do over the next few moments is to just be paying attention, to listen, take notes if you need to, but I suspect that for the most of you, you'll be fine just listening and taking some mental notes. So, I'm going to start by reading the extract. I remembered the case well, for it was one in which Holmes had taken an interest on account of the peculiar ferocity of the crime and the wanton brutality which had marked all the actions of the assassin. The commutation of his death sentence had been due to some doubts as to his complete sanity, so atrocious was his conduct. Our wagonette had topped a rise, and in front of us rose the huge expanse of the moor, mottled with gnarled and craggy cairns and tors. A cold wind swept down from it and set us shivering. Somewhere there, on that desolate plain, was lurking this fiendish man, hiding in a burrow like a wild beast, his heart full of malignancy against the whole race which had cast him out. It needed but this to complete the grim suggestiveness of the barren waste, the chilling wind, and the darkling sky. Even Baskerville fell silent and pulled his overcoat more closely around him. All right, so if we're looking at a couple of the key terms, first one that comes to my attention is peculiar ferocity. If something is peculiar, it's unusual. If something is ferocious, it's savage or violent. So the peculiar ferocity is a phrase here being used to identify the unusual brutality of the crime, which is then supported by the phrase wanton brutality. Of course, wanton not being those delicious, yummy treats that we all love so much, but in fact, pointing out the concept that it was unprovoked or deliberately premeditated. And again, brutality coming back to the concept of being highly violent. We then talk about the concept of commuting his sentence. If something is commuted, it's not you traveling to work. Commuted in this situation is the reduction of a sentence. So from a death sentence to a lesser penalty. I don't know, maybe being tortured by tickling with a feather or something like that. There's just no way to know. All right, the next word that comes to my attention is wagonette. And a wagonette looks like this wonderful creature here. It's four wheels, it's drawn by a horse. The driver sits on the front and the passengers are at the back. Fairly typical mode of conveyance for those who could afford it in the day, and a forerunner of today's automobile. Okay, we now talk about the moor. And a lot is made of the moor throughout the novella, being the main environment through which this takes place. The environmental cues are really important for the mystery. So the more you need to understand what a moor is in order to really appreciate a lot of the descriptions throughout the novella. So in our situation, the moor looks much like the image that I've put forward here. So it's usually uncultivated land, rocky or swampy in parts, either or both, and usually grassy. It's not the moor per Shakespeare's Othello. I dare say that if the entire play was written as though it was set on the back of Othello, that would actually be a really interesting experiment, but not for one for today. So the next thing is we're talking about being mottled and gnarled with craggy cairns and tors, which again is coming back to the description of the moor. And you can see a couple of images here, a tor being a natural formation of a rocky or hilly peak. Cairns tend to be man-made. They're usually stones stacked upon one another as a memorial or a landmark. You may well have seen them in films quite a bit. So we then talk about the term malignancy, and we'll talk about why it's used at the moment. But malignancy means evil. It is a malign, surreptitious thing. It sneaks, it's subtle. So by discussing the heart as being malign, you're talking about somebody having a distinct evil nature. Um, so what's happening over the course of this excerpt? So in the first section, um, and really the excerpt can be broken into 4 sections. At the first, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle is trying to impress upon us why Holmes would have remembered that there was a criminal out here in the first place. And the reason for that is because the crime was crazy brutal. And no normal or sane person could have done it. That's how brutal it was. So, for those of you who've seen The Murders in the Rue Morgue, or read it rather, I'm thinking about what the orangutan did in The Crimes There. I mean, that's an example of how over the top brutal the crime would be. And that's why our narrator Watson remembers it, because it caught Holmes' eye. And anything that is particularly interesting to Holmes is going to be memorable for Watson. Okay, and that's important because we see the story through Watson's eyes. So in the second section, he then digresses from the criminal back to today's adventure and specifically describing the landscape, the very bleak landscape that our story is being set in. And after having set and expand a concept in our minds of what this landscape looks like, in our third section of the story, he's reminding us of the threat and making a distinct link between the landscape and the criminal, and really putting it very clearly to us that the criminal is inhuman or subhuman or of a bestial nature. And that's quite important again. And perhaps this is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle trying to manipulate us into thinking that it's this criminal that has committed the murders at Baskerville. It's an interesting point. I'd actually be curious to see if it worked for very many people because it seems too obvious to me. All right. And then, of course, we link back in the fourth section, that last part of the excerpt, where we're back to the landscape and really reiterating the bestial nature of the criminal as a link to the bleak landscape, which only has a result of making this place seem colder and more foreboding. In fact, it's so bad that Henry Baskerville is at this stage described as falling silent and pulling his overcoat closely around him, as though the cold is getting to him, as though perhaps the rumors are getting to him, or the reality of his situation is getting to him. In any case, there's some food for thought there. So have a think about that excerpt, the 4 sections I've broken it into. In our next activity, we're going to look at one of those sections and we're going to pull it apart in considerable detail.